For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. He procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition, and had them bound in different colors, so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed, at times, to have almost entirely lost control. That was, of course, a quote from The Picture of Dorian Gray, the only novel written by today's Rainbow Relic. And I chose that quote because it very closely describes what that book was to me when I first read it, and what it remains to be. Every time I'm in a bookstore, I hunt for a new copy of the novel, one of the few aesthetic indulgences I'll allow myself in my day-to-day. And besides that, I think it paints a picture of the sort of person that comes to mind for most people who hear the name Oscar Wilde. Hi, my name is Mia, and welcome to another episode of Rainbow Relics, the series that introduces you to the incredible queer people that shaped our world's history. This week is all about Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. Links to sources and further readings are listed in the description below. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde dropped his middle names when he was around the age of 23 and studying at Magdalen College, Oxford. Little over 2 decades before, he was born as the second of 3 children to parents Sir William Wilde and Francesca Wilde. While his father's time was chiefly taken up by being the most renowned eye and ear surgeon of Dublin, he was known to have a keen interest in both archaeology and folklore, to the point where he wrote books on both of the subjects. Francesca shared this love of folklore with her husband, and was one of the leading authorities on the topic of Celtic mythology. She also wrote many revolutionary poems under her pen name Speranza. True to his parents' literary indulgences, Wilde was born at 21 Westland Row in Dublin, in what was to become the Oscar Wilde Centre of Trinity College. He was born on the 16th of October, making him one of the most unbalanced Libras to date, in the year of 1854. When he was 9 years old, Wilde started schooling at the Portora Royal School in Enniskillen in Ireland. A few years later, in 1871, at the age of 16, he enrolled in Trinity College on a scholarship until he completed his courses in 1874. His love of art and beauty blossomed, and his headstrong, individualistic nature became the perfect blend to fuel his satirical and socially critical projects. At Trinity, he was also a revered scholar of the classics, so much so that he was awarded the highest award available to classic scholars, the Berkeley Gold Medal, and he participated in the University Philosophical Society. It was probably ideas here that found their way into his essay The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which basically highlighted the Marxist idea that the problem with capitalism was that it crushed all creativity. Evidently, Wilde managed to shake free from the stifling capitalist prison. When he was 20, Wilde competed for and won a scholarship to attend Magdalen College, Oxford, and moved to England to study there in 1874. It was here that he let his aesthetic taste blossom to their fullest, dropped his middle names, and joined the Freemasons. I should mark this with a disclaimer that only 2 of my sources had any record of this, one of them being irishmasonhistory.com, so accuracy is uncertain, but it felt just out there enough to seem like something a young Wilde would theoretically get himself into. The account follows that he befriended Prince Leopold, who became his gateway to Freemasonry, dropping enough tidbits to ignite Wilde's curious nature. The fact that his father, Sir William, had been an active Mason in Ireland may have been enough of a reason for Wilde to be approached. In February 1875, middle name still intact, Wilde was approached by his acquaintance John Edward Courtney Bodley about admittance into the Apollo University Lodge, number 357, the standing lodge for all Freemasons past and present who had attended Oxford. At the proposed time of his initiation, on the 23rd of February, Wilde was still under the required age and so initiated by special dispensation by his friends who were already members. While he only stayed affiliated with the Freemasons for his 4 years at Magdalen, the beauty and mystery of the society influenced his role in the aesthetic movement for many years to come. The aesthetic movement, which Wilde's name is nearly synonymous with, began in England in 1868 before encompassing most of the Western world. It was a movement which prioritized art for art's sake, a massive slap in the face to the current traditions of tight-lipped Victorian England. Previously, all art had to be the vessel for a message, preferably one of an uplifting or enduring spirit. Aestheticism looked at art as a whole in itself. A message wasn't needed if beauty was the central tie of importance. Art didn't need to have a moral or a narrative, it just needed to be art. This mass contradiction made aestheticism an easy target for satirical work, and Wilde was at the heart of this content, alongside many of the people in his immediate social circle. The popular British publication Punch made Wilde the face of all immorality the aesthetic movement was meant to embody, a role Wilde took in his stride and played up as much as he possibly could. A caricature of himself named Bunthorne appeared in the comic opera Patience. Wilde went so far in reinforcing this that he wrote an entire selection of poems entitled, plainly, Poems, that was published in 1881, and in 1891, his essay collection Intentions defended the aesthetic attitude to art, citing ideas sent down by Theo Gautier and Charles Baudelaire before him. Despite the outrage that aestheticism caused and the effects taken to taint Wilde's name, his debauchery had yet to catch up with him. In 1882, he was still a revered enough figure to headline lectures all across the United States, preaching his view on loving art for its beauty alone. There is no doubt that Wilde worked just as hard as he played, and often due to the nature of his work, it is difficult to differentiate the two. While Poems is often considered his first work, he wrote another poem in 1878 entitled Rowena, which won him the prestigious Newdigate Prize. Between the years of 1887 to 1889, he began editing for the magazine Woman's World, writing off the experience he received reviewing features for the Pall Mall Gazette. From 1888, after The Happy Prince and Other Tales was published, Wilde started hauling out work thick and fast. His publications, collections, and plays were everywhere in London. But looking back in a more morbid light, his actions fall perfectly in line with a man who knows he has only 10 years left to live. In 1891, Wilde's two short story volumes, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime and A House of Pomegranates, graced England's shelves. But possibly what Wilde is most remembered for when it comes to his work is his society comedies, his plays. This is possibly due to the influence French styles had over his work. He was a genius when it came to marrying the paradoxical and the witty, and almost all of his work having a strong foothold in the art of the LGBT community, both then and now. His first major success was found in the productions of Lady Windermere's Fan, whose opening night solidified the symbolism of the Green Carnation. The flower became his symbol after he gave such a carnation to one of the leads of the play to wear on opening night. It was a soft illusion, a tongue-in-cheek ploy implemented by Wilde, and this symbol did not escape the curiosity of the Victorian press and critics. However, the only information Wilde would disclose about the importance of the carnation was that there was none, and looking for any meaning took away from what it was, a simple flower. But critics were not satisfied with such an aesthetic answer. They claimed that the flower was a symbol of nature imitating art, that the unnatural color and the embellishment that the flower was stood for all that was decadent and unnatural. There was a myth spread through the streets of Victorian England that green was a homosexual's favorite color and was highly fashionable in our circles. Regardless if it truly had no meaning or if Wilde was simply being coy, the power of the Green Carnation still echoes through to the present. And here I am directly referring to Elliot Page's Green Rose that we probably all have a picture of saved somewhere. As powerful as Lady Windermere's Fan was as a catalyst, Wilde still had far more creativity and controversy to offer up to the stage. 1893 saw the production of the French language. Wilde was a proficient linguist and spoke 5 languages. Anyway, 1893 saw the French language play Salome, but due to the fact that it was a macabre retelling of a biblical story, it was highly censored during both its staging and its English translation a year later. Wilde wrote 2 more plays in his career, An Ideal Husband and the world-famous The Importance of Being Earnest, which both graced theatres in the early months of 1895. The latter was of particular importance in bringing many Victorian hypocrisies to light, and in most of his work there is a prevailing theme of ruin and disgrace born out of a secret sin. In his essay, The Decay of Lying, Wilde himself said that this idea was the frame of most of his actions in life, specifically in his pursuit of pleasure. No better is this thought portrayed so clearly than it is in The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde's only novel, and, as you know from the introduction, my all-time favorite book. In the novel, Dorian's secret sin is literally portrayed in a hidden painting of himself, and his downfall comes from his inability in being comfortable in keeping this decay a secret any longer. The book, published in installments in Lippincott's magazine throughout 1890, and then as its expanded and reworked version in 1891, is infamous in its use as evidence in Wilde's famous trial. But we'll get to that later. In 1884, a nearly 30-year-old Oscar Wilde, middle names firmly dropped by this point, married a 26-year-old Constance Lloyd. Constance was the daughter of Adelaide Athenson Lloyd and the popular barrister Horace Lloyd, who passed away when his daughter was 16. This loss did not stop Lloyd from growing up into an outspoken and intelligent woman, even publishing a collection of stories she had learned from her grandmother in a book entitled There Was Once. Lloyd and Wilde had two sons together in Chelsea, Cyril, who was born in 1885, and Vivian, who was born a year later. Vivian is spelled Vyvyan, which feels a lot like Wilde's approach and twist to many of his life's events. He didn't have a strong relationship with his sons, or a very romantic relationship with Lloyd, living more in hotels and society lodgings in London than with his wife and family. While Lloyd was involved in the dress reform movement with her husband and supported his eccentricities, there is little evidence to suggest the extent of their relationship outside of mainly professional circles. There was probably a cordial friendship between the two, and Lloyd almost certainly knew of the nature of her husband's relationship with the young Lord Alfred Douglas, the spark to Wilde's downfall. If Wilde's relationship with Lloyd was respectful and almost utilitarian, that which he had with Douglas was almost its perfect opposite. Wilde and Douglas, who is far better known to Wilde as Bosie, met in June 1891. At the time, Douglas was an undergraduate at Oxford and a more than talented poet. He fascinated Wilde, who likened him to Hyacinthus and himself to Apollo. I guess in the eyes of history, the roles are reversed, but the parallel Wilde drew solidifies how enamored he was by the young Douglas. At first, their relationship was heated, tempestuous, and never seemed more than a surface-level game to Wilde. But as time went on, it was obvious how deep their affections ran. In a letter to his publisher Leonard Smithers on the 1st of October 1897, Wilde says that Douglas understands me and my art and loves both. And the strength of their connection did not escape the attentions of the people all around them. One of these people being Douglas's father, who wanted to sue Wilde for what he saw as his corrupting influence over his son. In a fashion very much typical of himself, Wilde tried to take Douglas Sr. to court for libel, but quickly backed down at Bosie's insistence and the weight of the evidence stacked up against him. His friends begged him to flee and seek refuge in France, but the damage was already done. Wilde was arrested and ordered to stand trial against the charge of gross indecency, which is a fancy way of saying being gay. At first, probably due to the immense celebrity of Wilde, the jury failed to reach a verdict either way. But the matter would not be so easily dropped. In a retrial upon the same charges, he was found guilty. Much of his work, as well as the iconic Green Carnation, were presented to reach the final sentence. Upon the eve of the final trial, on the 29th of April, Wilde penned a letter to Douglas. He stated that no matter what pain and suffering he was to endure, he would take it without letting it stop his love. In May 1895, Oscar Wilde was sent to 2 years' hard labor at the Reading jail on the charges of sodomy. He took his punishment with his head held as high as he could, and not even imprisonment could stop his writing. Under his conditions, it's no surprise that Reading Jail was the birthplace of the potent letter De Profundis addressed to Douglas. For all its accusations, the intense emotions relayed in it could only have come from a place already saturated with such strong emotions. You can only hate on the spectrum of that which you love. Wilde served out his 2 years and was released in the May of 1897 and moved directly to France. There he was visited by his friends Max Beerbohm and Robert Ross and, finally, reunited with Alfred Douglas. In 1898, Wilde released his final work, The Battle of Reading Gaol, where he highlighted the extent of its appalling prison conditions. He had contracted an ear infection while in prison, which quickly began turning into acute meningitis. Knowing he had little time left, Wilde begged the Catholic Church to baptize him, believing his chances after death to be better, since the religion accepted both sinners and saints. It was a conditional baptism, as he had already been baptized as a child, but it was all he wanted. On the 30th of November 1900, the final chapter of Oscar Wilde's life finally came to a close. Looking back on all of this, I was surprised how far more famous Wilde is now compared to Douglas. Lord Alfred Douglas. This man wasn't any lower-class love that Wilde happened to meet. He held a highly esteemed position in Victorian society, and yet we remember Wilde and not Douglas. And in a very surface-level search, I found that he was also involved in LGBT awareness and activism work. Possibly this will be a subject for a later episode. But yeah, I don't think the lovers of these people who we know shape our queer history could be overlooked at someone else's footnote. And they deserve recognition just as much as anyone else does, no matter their social standing. But because Douglas was so important in the society he was in, I wasn't expecting this.